40 years ago today, a protest by black school children in Soweto, South Africa turned bloody. It became known as the Soweto uprising, one of the seminal events in South Africa's history, which, with the benefit of hindsight, can be said to have marked the beginning of the end of white minority rule in the country. Here's Sam Israel on the day that changed South Africa forever.
It was the turning point in the resistance to end South African apartheid. On June 16, 1976, thousands of black South African students took to the streets of Soweto, outside Johannesburg. They had had enough of the government's racist policies. The final straw was a new decree that would have forced them to be taught in Afrikaans, for them, the language of the oppressor.
We thought at the time that it was a strategy by the apartheid regime to hamper our progress education-wise, so that we don't achieve anything.
Police responded with lethal force to the protests, using tear gas and live ammunition. Casualty figures are disputed. Some reports say police killed over 170 people, but others give a much higher number, saying as many as 700 in some accounts. Thousands more were wounded. As demonstrators laid in agony with wounds by bullets and beatings, few people thought that there was a way to move forward to freedom.
I didn't expect that somebody could just die from, marching and with a fist clenched, but it happened.
But the protests in Soweto changed everything. Footage of the uprising made South Africa's reality impossible to ignore. And in the end, that day became the catalyst to the eventual collapse of the white South African minority regime in 1994. But even decades later, the wounds of the Soweto uprising still feel fresh. Divisions in race are still strong despite reforms, and South Africa's system of education still doesn't provide enough for many students. The commemorations throughout the country are a reminder of the day that marked the beginning of the end of apartheid. But one can only wonder if South Africa has truly reconciled 4 decades after black students and white policemen clashed on the streets.
And joining me now, i24 News editor Jeff Abramowitz, who was in Johannesburg at the time and lived through the events. Good evening.
Hi.
So we just heard in the report the uprising was the beginning of the end for white South Africa, but that's all in hindsight. Hindsight is always maybe 20/20. What was the feeling there at the time?
Well, at the time, the overwhelming feeling, I think, was shock. There were many of us who wanted apartheid to end, hoped apartheid would end, but we knew apartheid would end, but we just didn't believe it, and we were taken by surprise. Among the majority of whites, though, I think it was the biggest nightmare come true. Blacks were rising up against the government.
Did you realize while it was happening that it was going to be what it would be?
No. The thing is, things are always inconceivable until they happen, and then they become inevitable. And at the time, nobody was prepared. The government was so strong, was so repressive, was a police state, that nobody thought it could happen, that apartheid could end.
So let's talk about the government. How did the South African government react back then?
Well, the way the South African government of the time always reacted to anything, which was a lot of balderdash, bombastic nonsense about outside forces trying to create a division, because in the South African government's mind, they believed blacks and whites were living in harmony. They were trying at the time to present apartheid, a kind of gentler apartheid, if you like, which, it's still apartheid no matter how. And they were also trying to forge ties with black Africa. And then this happened, and everything fell apart. The government initially became more repressive. Students who protested were arrested, organizations were banned. But I think in the long term, some of the more intelligent members of the South African government, and I think there were 1 or 2, they realized that the status quo couldn't continue.
So tell me your personal memories of this. You lived through this. What do you remember of that time?
Well, I was on my first reporting job, and in the office, when we heard the news, a group of us grabbed a camera and an office car and drove to Soweto. We got as far as a police roadblock, and we were turned back.
What a first reporting job. What a job for a young reporter.
You've got to start somewhere. we were turned back. The police were very tense, very nervous. The South African government hated the English language media. Most policemen were members of the were supporters. And along come 3 or 4 guys with long hair, beards, smoking funny cigarettes. So I don't know why we even thought they'd let us in. We tried 3 or 4 roadblocks. We were turned back. We went back to the office, listened to the radio. The next day, I think, there was a student march protesting the police brutality. We joined it. The police waded in with students from the technical college. It was very bloody, very nasty, iron bars, chains. If you remember memories of the freedom marches in the American South, it was something like that.
Images that recall that. Just briefly, what do you remember sort of hearing from people at the time, from your colleagues, from people on the street?
Well, people on the street were shocked. They were flummoxed. They had nobody actually thought it would ever happen. The whites, the majority of whites, were totally cut off from black society. Nobody knew the anger, the depth of anger. We knew that, well, the blacks probably don't like apartheid, but nobody knew how deep it went. Nobody knew what it felt like to be black. So they were taken totally by surprise. A lot of people said things like, we built them schools, we gave them this, and they burned them down. Well, they can starve, which is a normal knee-jerk reaction. And a lot of people started planning to leave South Africa. I mean, among some South Africans in Israel, we talk about the Soweto Aliyah, the immigration to Israel caused by Soweto. Okay. A lot of whites saw the writing on the wall, and fled as soon as they could.
Fascinating look back into history, and important to see how things look when they're happening and how they look in hindsight. Jeff Abramowitz, thanks very much for being with me.